Hey guys, tonight we are going to drift slowly into the dusty, sun-bleached world of the American frontier, a place that, in films, looks wide and heroic and slightly overexposed, a place where men squint meaningfully into the distance while dramatic music swells. But we are not here for dramatic music. We are here for paperwork, exhaustion, and the deeply awkward profession of being paid to bring someone back, preferably alive, but not necessarily. And yes, before we wander too far into the desert, if you enjoy this particular flavor of slow, uneventful historical storytelling, remember to quietly subscribe. No rush. The frontier isn't going anywhere. Now, bounty hunters. In the mythology of the Wild West, they are lone wolves, stoic, mysterious, possibly chewing something. They move through saloons with boots that somehow echo louder than everyone else's, but in reality, bounty hunters were less myth and more contract labor. They existed because law enforcement in much of the 19th century American West was thin, vast territories, scattered towns, sheriffs with maybe 2 deputies, and a horse that was honestly not in peak condition. When someone skipped bail, robbed a stagecoach, or shot a man over a card game that was already going poorly, the local authorities often did not have the manpower to chase them across 3 territories and a desert. So instead, they posted a notice, a reward, a number written in ink. $50, $100, sometimes more if the crime had been particularly enthusiastic. And that's where the bounty hunter comes in. Technically, many of them were operating under a legal principle inherited from English common law. If you posted bail for someone and they fled, you, or someone acting on your behalf, had the right to retrieve them. This made bounty hunting not entirely illegal, which is a lovely detail. It was not necessarily respected, but it was legal enough. The profession attracted a certain type of person, not necessarily the fastest draw in the West. More often, it attracted men who were persistent, men who could follow a rumor across counties, men who could ask quiet questions in saloons without getting stabbed. It required patience and an impressive tolerance for discomfort. The Wild West, as it turns out, was not climate-controlled. Imagine riding for days under a sun that seems personally offended by your existence, your water supply shrinking, your horse reconsidering its life choices. All this because someone decided robbing a train was easier than honest employment. The bounty hunter's work was not glamorous. It was logistical. You had to track movements, check telegraph offices, read handbills tacked to wooden posts, maybe talk to a barber who heard something from a cousin who once saw the outlaw near a river. And even when you found your target, things did not instantly turn cinematic. Most wanted men did not politely wait in the middle of the street at noon. They hid. They blended into mining camps. They changed names. Facial hair was extremely flexible in the 1870s. A beard today, clean-shaven tomorrow. Identity was negotiable. Approaching an outlaw required caution, because while you were technically acting under the law, the outlaw was often armed and sometimes surrounded by friends who were also armed. The bounty hunter had to decide: attempt a quiet arrest at night, confront them publicly and risk a shootout, or wait for a moment when the outlaw was distracted by soup. There is something deeply unromantic about tackling a fugitive while he is holding a spoon. And then there is the matter of reputation. Bounty hunters were feared, yes, but they were also distrusted. Townspeople did not always see them as heroes. They were outsiders, paid hunters of men, not elected officials, not community members. They followed money, which meant their moral alignment could appear flexible. Some bounty hunters were professional and restrained, others were less so. The system did not come with a universal code of ethics neatly printed on parchment. Mistaken identities happened, excessive force happened, and sometimes, tragically, innocent people were caught in the middle. This unpredictability is part of why they were feared, not because they wore black hats and lurked in alleys, but because they operated in the gray areas. They crossed state lines. They knocked on doors at inconvenient hours. They asked very direct questions, and they did not always take "he left town" as a satisfying answer. For outlaws, the fear was simple. A bounty hunter would not get bored. A sheriff might have other duties, taxes, jail repairs, community picnics, but a bounty hunter's entire financial stability depended on not giving up. Imagine knowing that somewhere, someone you have never met is patiently riding in your direction, calculating distances, asking about you in towns you thought were forgettable, measuring the value of your capture in dollars. It is not the loud, explosive fear of a duel at high noon. It is the quiet fear of persistence. And in a land where distances were vast and communication slow, persistence was often more dangerous than speed. So while films gave us dramatic standoffs and orchestral tension, the historical reality was slower, dustier, filled with paperwork, negotiation, and long, uncomfortable rides across landscapes that did not particularly care who won. And that, perhaps, is what made bounty hunters truly unsettling, not because they were mythical gunmen, but because they were methodical. Methodical men are rarely the loudest people in the room. They are not the ones flipping poker tables or making speeches about destiny. They are the ones sitting quietly near the wall, listening. In the Wild West, that kind of patience could be more dangerous than any flashy revolver trick. A bounty hunter's work often began not with a chase, but with a sheet of paper, a warrant, a reward notice, a description that was, by modern standards, almost charmingly vague. Male, medium build, brown hair, last seen wearing a hat. Which was helpful, because approximately 94% of men in the West fit that description. Tracking someone in the 19th century required a certain acceptance of uncertainty. There were no centralized databases, no digital records, just word of mouth, telegraph messages, and whatever scraps of information you could gather from people who might not be especially motivated to help you. You would ride into a town and ask questions carefully. Too aggressive, and people shut down. Too casual, and no one took you seriously. Somewhere between polite curiosity and quiet menace was the correct tone. "Have you seen this man?" Pause. Long sip of something. "He might have passed through," which might mean yes or no, or perhaps the speaker simply enjoyed being mysterious. Bounty hunters learned to read silences. They learned to notice who avoided eye contact, who left the saloon abruptly, who suddenly found the floorboard fascinating. The frontier was small in population, even if it was large in geography. Strangers stood out. So did men asking about other men. There was also the financial calculation. Rewards were not unlimited. If a fugitive had a $50 bounty and you spent 3 weeks chasing him across 2 territories, paying for lodging, food, and horse care, the profit margin began to look thin. The math could become uncomfortably honest. This is another reason bounty hunters were feared. They had to decide whether the effort was worth it. A higher reward meant more determination. A notorious outlaw with a large price on his head might attract multiple hunters. Competition added tension, not just between hunter and hunted, but between hunters themselves. Imagine the awkwardness of tracking the same man as someone else, both of you pretending not to be doing exactly that. Sharing a campfire, watching each other, calculating who might reach the fugitive first. Cooperation was possible. So was betrayal. The frontier did not come with human resources guidelines. And then there is the arrest itself. Contrary to popular belief, most captures did not involve elaborate gunfights at noon under dramatic clouds. Gunfights were loud, dangerous, risky to bystanders, and inconvenient for anyone hoping to get paid. Bringing someone in alive was often preferable. Dead men could not confirm their identities very effectively. Alive, a fugitive could be transported, identified, and formally returned to the jurisdiction that wanted him. This required rope, restraint, and the deeply uncomfortable experience of riding for miles beside someone who did not appreciate your company. Picture it: 2 men on horseback, one free, one tied, days of travel, minimal conversation, occasional glaring. It was less cinematic showdown and more extended, resentful road trip. And danger did not end once the fugitive was captured. Friends of the outlaw might attempt a rescue. Family members might intervene. Angry acquaintances might decide that they did not care for bounty hunters operating in their town. A hunter was often alone, transporting a prisoner across vast distances. Sleep was shallow. Meals were quick. Trust was rare. There was also the legal ambiguity that hovered over the profession. While bounty hunters had certain rights derived from bail enforcement, crossing territorial or state lines could complicate matters. Local officials did not always appreciate outsiders arriving with tied-up men and confident explanations. You have no authority here. An argument could follow, or worse, paperwork. And paperwork, in any century, has the power to exhaust even the most determined individual. The public perception of bounty hunters was shaped by this mixture of legality and aggression. They were not sheriffs elected by the community. They were not judges. They were private actors operating within a fragile legal framework. Their loyalty was to the reward. This made them efficient. It also made them unsettling. If you were an outlaw, you might assume you could outrun a single town's law enforcement, but you could not so easily outrun a financial incentive. As long as your name was on a poster, you represented potential income. And income has a way of motivating people through heat, hunger, and boredom. The fear, then, was not just of violence, it was of inevitability. Because somewhere out there, in a landscape of dust and telegraph wires, a methodical stranger might be reading your description by lamplight, calculating distances, planning a route, adjusting his saddle, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. Steadiness, in the 19th century West, was an underrated survival skill. Outlaws often relied on speed and chaos. A robbery executed quickly. A horse ridden hard. A sudden disappearance into open country. The hope was that distance alone would dissolve consequences. And sometimes, for a while, it did. But bounty hunters were built for the long stretch. They did not need to be the fastest rider in the territory. They needed to be the one still riding after everyone else decided it was too much trouble. Dust storms, swollen rivers, broken wagon trails. None of these were especially dramatic in the moment. They were just inconvenient. and inconvenience, repeated daily, can wear down both hunter and hunted in equal measure. The geography of the West made everything larger than it felt in movies. Towns were scattered. Rail lines were expanding, but incomplete. Vast plains and desert regions created natural hiding spaces. A man could vanish into a mining camp under a new name, take work shoveling ore, and keep his head down for months. But hiding required routine, and routine created patterns. Bounty hunters learned to look for those patterns. A letter sent from a particular telegraph office, supplies purchased regularly from a general store, a man who paid in cash but never stayed long. Even in a place as fluid as the frontier, habits formed quietly. Tracking was less about dramatic footprints in the sand and more about patient observation. It involved sitting for long stretches, listening to ordinary conversations. The West was loud with rumors. Stories traveled faster than trains. A bar fight in Kansas might be discussed in Colorado within days, exaggerated slightly for entertainment. Some bounty hunters cultivated informants, bartenders, stable hands, railroad workers, people who noticed things because their jobs required it. A stranger with a scar, a man who asked about routes south, a customer who avoided eye contact when certain topics arose. Information was currency, and bounty hunters were willing to trade for it. Of course, not every pursuit ended neatly. Some fugitives escaped entirely. They changed territories. They boarded ships. They disappeared into larger cities where anonymity was easier to maintain. In those cases, the bounty hunter absorbed the loss. Weeks of effort dissolved into nothing. No reward, just sunburn and fatigue. That uncertainty contributed to the aura around them. If a bounty hunter succeeded, it meant persistence had paid off. If he failed, he rarely advertised it. Reputation in the West was a fragile thing. You wanted people to believe that once you took a contract, it ended in capture. This reputation alone could generate fear. Imagine sitting in a small boarding house, aware that your name is on a wanted poster. Every knock at the door becomes suspicious. Every new arrival in town draws your attention. The hunter does not need to be visible to influence your behavior. The possibility of his arrival is enough. Sleep becomes lighter. Conversations become cautious. Travel plans become complicated. Fear does not always need a face, and yet, when the face did appear, it was often surprisingly ordinary. Bounty hunters did not wear uniforms. They did not carry badges that announced authority. They dressed like other men of the frontier, dusty coats, worn boots, practical hats, which meant they could sit in a saloon for hours without attracting attention until they stood up. Confrontations were usually tense but brief. A quiet word, a sudden grip on the arm, a warning not to reach for a weapon. If things went well, the fugitive complied, calculating that survival was preferable to a dramatic end. If things went poorly, violence followed. Gunfire in a wooden building is not as glamorous as it appears on screen. It is deafening. It splinters walls. It endangers everyone present. Many bounty hunters preferred to avoid it entirely. There is also the question of morality, which hovered uncomfortably over the profession. Were bounty hunters heroes enforcing justice, or opportunists exploiting legal loopholes for profit? The answer, inconveniently, varied. Some pursued dangerous criminals who had genuinely harmed others. Others chased men who had defaulted on debts or minor offenses magnified by frontier conditions. The law itself was evolving. Territories became states, legal systems grew more structured. Over time, formal law enforcement expanded, reducing the need for freelance pursuit. But in those transitional decades, bounty hunters filled a gap defined by distance, limited resources, and the slow spread of institutional authority. They were feared because they operated in that gap, not as symbols of order, not as embodiments of chaos, but as reminders that even in a land of wide horizons and second chances, someone might still be keeping track. Quietly. Keeping track in the Old West was not a glamorous activity. It involved ledgers, notes folded into coat pockets, descriptions copied by hand from one poster to another. A bounty hunter might carry several names at once, each attached to a number, each number representing a calculation. Time spent versus reward offered, distance versus probability of success. It was less romance, more arithmetic. The myth tells us that bounty hunters chased the most infamous outlaws, bank robbers, trained bandits, men whose names would later appear in dime novels. And yes, occasionally they did. But far more often, they pursued smaller targets. Men who skipped bail after a bar fight, horse thieves whose crime was both common and deeply irritating, swindlers who vanished after collecting money for goods that did not exist. Horse theft, in particular, carried serious weight. A horse was transportation, livelihood, and survival wrapped into one animal. Steal a horse, and you were not merely inconveniencing someone, you were potentially endangering their life. Communities reacted strongly. Rewards were posted quickly, which meant bounty hunters had steady work. The fear attached to them grew partly from unpredictability. You did not always know when your name might appear on a notice board. The frontier justice system was uneven. What was tolerated in one town might provoke outrage in another. A dispute over property lines could escalate. A drunken argument could result in charges. And if bail was set and skipped, the machinery of pursuit began to turn. Slowly, but reliably. There is something particularly unsettling about being hunted not out of personal vengeance, but because of a contract, a piece of paper, a number. The bounty hunter did not need to hate you. He did not need to be angry. He simply needed the reward. That emotional detachment could be chilling. At the same time, bounty hunters themselves lived in a strange social position. They were necessary, but rarely beloved. Towns relied on them, especially when resources were stretched thin. Yet once the fugitive was delivered, gratitude could evaporate quickly. They were outsiders by design, moving constantly, rarely settling. A man who stayed too long in one place risked becoming part of the community, and part of the community might hesitate before dragging a neighbor back in chains. Professional distance preserved effectiveness, but distance also meant loneliness. Long rides across open land did not offer much conversation. Campsites under wide skies were quiet in a way that felt almost exaggerated. The frontier night could stretch endlessly, wind moving through grass, the low shuffle of a horse adjusting its weight, and somewhere, perhaps days ahead, a man unaware that his name was being spoken in hushed tones. Fear operates in both directions. The outlaw feared capture. The bounty hunter feared failure. Failure meant lost income, a damaged reputation, the possibility that future clients would choose someone else. And there were risks beyond gunfire. Illness traveled easily. A minor injury could become serious far from medical help. Horses stumbled, rivers flooded, weather shifted without warning. A pursuit that began confidently could dissolve into survival against the environment itself. The West did not particularly care about contracts. It did not adjust temperatures to accommodate professional obligations. And yet, bounty hunters persisted, because persistence was the core of the profession. You did not need to be charming. You did not need to be popular. You needed stamina. You needed a willingness to ask the same question in town after town, to follow small clues without losing interest, to endure boredom without abandoning the trail. Boredom, in fact, may have been the true test. Hours of riding, days of nothing happening, weeks of near misses. The cinematic version condenses events into thrilling sequences. The historical version stretches them into long intervals punctuated by brief, decisive moments. And in those moments, when a fugitive realized who was standing in front of him, the fear crystallized, not because the bounty hunter shouted, not because he was especially dramatic, but because he had arrived after all the distance, after all the waiting. He had arrived, quietly. Arrival in the West was rarely announced with fanfare. There were no orchestras hidden behind water troughs, no gust of wind perfectly timed for dramatic effect. Often, it was just a man stepping off a horse, brushing dust from his coat, and walking through a wooden door that creaked in a deeply uncooperative way. For the fugitive, that moment could feel unreal. You convince yourself after enough weeks that you have succeeded. You crossed a river. You changed your name. You grew a beard that was objectively an improvement. You found work in a town where no one asked too many questions. You began to believe the past was dissolving behind you, and then someone who does not belong here is asking about you. That is the psychological weight bounty hunters carried. They represented unfinished business, a reminder that distance did not erase accountability. The frontier offered opportunity, yes, reinvention, occasionally. But it also preserved grudges in ink. A reward poster did not forget, and bounty hunters were the physical expression of that memory. Interestingly, not all captures ended with violence or even resistance. Many fugitives, upon realizing who stood before them, calculated the odds with surprising calm. Running again meant repeating the entire cycle, hiding, watching doors, distrusting strangers, sleep fractured by every unfamiliar sound. At some point, exhaustion replaces defiance. There are documented cases of wanted men surrendering quietly, as if relieved. The chase had become its own burden. To be caught was, paradoxically, to end uncertainty. Jail was unpleasant. Court was unpredictable. But at least it was defined. The bounty hunter's job, in that sense, was to collapse ambiguity into consequence. And yet, the collapse was not always tidy. Transporting a prisoner required logistics, food for two, water for two, restraints that were secure but not lethal, campsites chosen carefully to avoid ambush. The journey back could be longer than the chase itself, especially if terrain or weather intervened. Imagine days of riding beside someone who resents you deeply. Conversation minimal, occasionally tense. The bounty hunter must remain alert. A sudden shove, a desperate lunge, a hidden knife. Trust was not part of the arrangement. The towns they passed through reacted in mixed ways. Some saw justice being carried out. Others saw a man in chains and felt discomfort. Frontier communities were complex. Personal relationships mattered. If the fugitive had friends or family nearby, tensions could rise quickly. A bounty hunter had to navigate not only landscapes, but emotions. And then finally, there was the handover, the moment when the fugitive was delivered to the appropriate authority. Paperwork signed, identity confirmed, payment issued. The exchange could be surprisingly mundane. A clerk counting bills, a sheriff offering a nod, perhaps a brief acknowledgement of effort. No parade, just transaction completed. The money, once received, did not last forever. Supplies needed replenishing, horses required care, equipment wore down. And so the cycle began again. Another poster, another name, another calculation. Over time, as territories became states and law enforcement structures strengthened, the role of freelance bounty hunters diminished. Professional police forces expanded, communication improved, railroads tightened the map. The vastness that once shielded fugitives slowly narrowed. But during that transitional era, those decades when institutions lagged behind expansion, bounty hunters thrived. They were feared not because they were supernatural figures moving through shadows. They were feared because they embodied persistence in a land that often rewarded disappearance. You could outrun a single town. You could outshoot a deputy. But you could not easily outlast someone whose income depended on your capture. And that, perhaps, is the most quietly unsettling truth about bounty hunters in the Wild West. They were not louder than everyone else. They were simply more patient. Patience, unfortunately for everyone involved, has a way of stretching time. In the West, time already felt expansive. Days measured not by clocks, but by the angle of the sun. Distances calculated in hours of riding rather than miles. A bounty hunter operated inside that slow rhythm, letting it work in his favor. If a fugitive fled in a burst of urgency, the bounty hunter answered with endurance. There were practical tools involved, of course. Firearms were common, though not always used. Ropes, shackles, handcuffs of varying quality, a saddlebag containing essentials, spare ammunition, dried food, perhaps a rolled blanket, sometimes a folded stack of wanted notices with creased edges from overhandling. But tools alone did not define the job. Information did. Telegraph lines were gradually knitting the country together. Messages that once took weeks could travel in hours. Bounty hunters sometimes relied on these lines to confirm sightings or coordinate with authorities in other territories. A brief message tapped out across wires could redirect an entire pursuit. Seen in Abilene, heading south, 3 short words and the landscape shifted. Still, the telegraph was not everywhere. Vast areas remained disconnected. In those regions, the old methods dominated. Word of mouth, handwritten letters, riders carrying news between settlements. The bounty hunter had to function comfortably within uncertainty, adjusting plans when information proved wrong. And information was often wrong. A man resembling the fugitive might be detained, questioned, and released in embarrassment. A rumor could send a hunter days in the wrong direction. The West was filled with men who shared similar appearances. Hats pulled low, dust-covered coats, expressions permanently narrowed against sunlight. Mistakes carried consequences, not only moral ones, but reputational. Capture the wrong man too often, and your name lost credibility. In a profession built on trust in your effectiveness, that mattered. So bounty hunters developed caution. They asked follow-up questions. They compared scars, accents, habits. They tried to confirm identity before making a move. This attention to detail contributed to their fearsome image. They did not charge in recklessly. They observed. They waited. They ensured that when they acted, it was deliberate. For the fugitive, this meant there was no predictable pattern to anticipate. The hunter might confront you in a crowded street, or he might wait until you were alone. He might pose as a traveler, or he might openly declare his purpose. Uncertainty erodes confidence, and confidence in the frontier was often the only shield a man had. There were also bounty hunters who gained regional notoriety, men whose names appeared in newspapers, not because they were glamorous, but because they were efficient. Their presence alone could unsettle a wanted man. If he's after you, you're going back. Such statements, repeated enough times, acquire weight. Yet the job remained precarious. Injury was common in frontier life. A twisted ankle while tracking through rough terrain, a fall from a horse, an infected cut. Medical care was inconsistent. A bounty hunter, incapacitated far from town, faced the same vulnerabilities as anyone else. There was no institutional safety net. In many ways, bounty hunters mirrored the broader instability of the era. They operated in a society still defining its boundaries. Law was spreading, but not evenly. Authority existed, but often thinly stretched. They filled a gap between chaos and order, and gaps, by nature, are uncomfortable places to stand. Over time, as formal policing structures solidified, the romanticized image of the bounty hunter began to grow in literature and later in film. Stories simplified them into archetypes: the stoic pursuer, the morally ambiguous tracker, the lone figure silhouetted against a sunset. The historical reality, however, remained slower. Less silhouette, more dust. Less orchestral tension, more ledger entries. If they were feared, it was not because they represented unstoppable violence. It was because they represented follow-through, a quiet, persistent reminder that actions, even in a vast and forgiving landscape, could circle back, eventually. And the West, for all its open horizons, could feel surprisingly small when someone was determined enough to cross it. Eventually, the frontier began to shrink. Railroads stitched territories together with iron lines. Telegraph poles marched across plains in tidy intervals. Towns that once felt isolated became stops on larger routes. As communication improved and institutions strengthened, the chaotic gaps that bounty hunters once navigated started to narrow. But during their peak decades, those gaps were wide enough to build an entire profession. The fear they inspired did not rely on spectacle. It relied on the uncomfortable truth that someone, somewhere, might care enough about a posted reward to come looking. In a world where distance was supposed to grant freedom, that possibility felt invasive. Imagine believing you have successfully vanished. You changed your name to something forgettable. You work quietly. You avoid conflict. You tell yourself the past has grown bored of you. And then, in the corner of a general store, you notice a man reading a notice board a little too carefully. He does not look like a sheriff. He does not wear authority on his sleeve. He looks ordinary, which is precisely the problem. The bounty hunter's ordinariness allowed him to move unnoticed. He blended into stagecoach lines, into cattle drives, into boarding houses. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that seemed casual until they weren't. For fugitives, the paranoia could be exhausting. Every stranger became a possibility. Every traveler with dust on his boots might have ridden a long way for a specific reason. Fear seeps into routine. Meals taste different. Sleep grows thin. This psychological pressure sometimes achieved what force did not. A fugitive might flee again prematurely, revealing himself in the process. He might trust the wrong person. He might attempt to leave town too quickly, drawing attention. Persistence works quietly. Yet it is important to remember that bounty hunters were not omnipotent. Many outlaws successfully evaded capture for years. Some reinvented themselves entirely, others fled beyond U.S. borders, complicating jurisdiction. The frontier was vast enough to offer second chances, occasionally permanent ones. But the presence of bounty hunters complicated that hope. They symbolized a form of accountability that traveled. Even so, communities held mixed feelings about them. While victims appreciated recovered property or captured criminals, others saw bounty hunting as opportunistic. The reward system could incentivize aggression. It could blur lines between justice and profit. And when profit enters the equation, motives are scrutinized. Were all pursuits noble? Certainly not. Some bounty hunters accepted contracts that today would seem minor or ethically ambiguous. The 19th century legal landscape included debt disputes, minor infractions, and uneven enforcement shaped by local politics. Context matters. The West was not a single, unified moral environment. It was a mosaic of territories, cultures, and rapidly changing laws. Bounty hunters operated within that complexity, navigating not just geography, but social tension. Freelance bounty hunter became less freelance bounty hunter, became less central to maintain an order. But the legend endured. Stories simplified them into archetypes because archetypes are easier to remember than ledgers and telegraph receipts. The cinematic version survived because it was exciting. High noon, long shadows, dramatic pauses. The historical version, however, remains quieter. A man reading a poster by lamplight, a horse saddled before sunrise, a question asked in a saloon that sounds casual, but is not. Why were bounty hunters feared in the Wild West? Not because they were always the fastest, not because they were always the deadliest, but because they were willing to continue across distance, across time, across doubt. In a land built on the promise of starting over, they were a reminder that the past could travel too, and it traveled patiently. And patience, as we've gently discovered, can be more unsettling than gunfire. Gunfire is loud, it announces itself, it ends quickly. Patience, on the other hand, sits quietly at the edge of your life and waits for you to make a mistake. For many fugitives in the Wild West, the most exhausting part was not the initial escape. It was maintaining the escape. Reinvention required consistency. A new name had to be remembered, a backstory had to be believable. You could not accidentally refer to a town you had never visited. You could not react too strongly to your own name being spoken across a room. Living like that, day after day, is a slow strain. And bounty hunters relied on that strain. They understood that fugitives were human. Humans become tired, careless, lonely. They write letters home. They boast when drunk. They trust the wrong companion. They fall in love. They get nostalgic. Every emotional weakness was a thread that could be pulled. Bounty hunters did not need to control the entire landscape. They only needed to tug the right thread. Sometimes that thread was financial. A fugitive might run out of money and take work under his real name by accident. Sometimes it was social. An old acquaintance might recognize him and mention it casually in conversation. Sometimes it was pride. Outlaws occasionally enjoyed their own notoriety and spoke too freely about past exploits. In each case, the hunter did not create the mistake. He simply waited for it. This is why the fear of bounty hunters extended beyond criminals themselves. Even those who had done nothing illegal understood the underlying message. The frontier was not entirely lawless. It was loosely stitched together, yes, imperfect, expanding faster than it could regulate. But it was not empty of consequence. Someone was keeping records. Someone was assigning value to wrongdoing. Someone might decide that value was worth pursuing. That knowledge subtly shaped behavior. It encouraged caution. It discouraged certain risks. It reminded people that distance was not immunity. And then there were the rare, dramatic captures that fed the legend. Newspapers loved them. A dangerous outlaw tracked across multiple states. A tense standoff resolved with precision. These stories traveled widely, reinforcing the image of the relentless hunter. But newspapers rarely detailed the quieter weeks, the waiting in boarding houses, the endless questioning, the false leads, the long rides through wind that did not care about narrative pacing. History, when examined closely, is often far less dramatic than its retellings. The Wild West was no exception. It was dusty, bureaucratic, occasionally violent, frequently boring. And within that boredom, bounty hunters operated effectively. Their fear factor came from reliability. If a reward was posted, someone might answer it. If someone answered it, they might not stop easily. If they did not stop easily, eventually they might arrive. Not dramatically, not with a trumpet fanfare, just a knock on the door. The profession itself gradually faded as systems matured. Modern policing structures reduced reliance on freelance pursuit. Legal jurisdictions became clearer. Communication accelerated. Transportation improved. The vast silences of the frontier filled with infrastructure. But the psychological imprint remained. We still imagine the bounty hunter as a solitary figure moving steadily toward a target. It is a compelling image because it reflects a universal anxiety that unfinished actions do not disappear. In the Wild West, that anxiety had boots and a saddle and a habit of asking very calm, very direct questions. So why were bounty hunters feared? Because they represented follow-through in a landscape built on escape. Because they were not easily distracted. Because they did not require personal anger to pursue you. Only a contract and time, lots and lots of time, which in the slow, expansive quiet of the frontier was usually available in abundance. Time, in the end, was the most reliable accomplice a bounty hunter ever had. The frontier changed quickly in some ways. New towns, new rail lines, new fortunes discovered in the ground. But human habits changed slowly, and bounty hunters depended on that slowness. They understood that even in a landscape obsessed with fresh starts, people carried pieces of themselves wherever they went. A fugitive might switch names, but he would still walk with the same posture, laugh in the same way, favor one hand over the other, order the same drink. Habits are stubborn, and stubbornness can be traced. This is where the quiet skill of observation mattered more than bravado. The bounty hunter did not need to dominate a room. He needed to notice what others ignored. A glance exchanged too quickly. A hesitation before answering a simple question. A man who seemed too interested in whether strangers were asking about him. These were small things, but the profession was built on small things. It is easy to imagine fear in the form of galloping hooves and raised pistols. It is harder, perhaps more realistic, to imagine fear as a slow realization, the realization that someone is piecing together fragments of your life, that your attempt to dissolve into the horizon has not gone entirely unnoticed. That realization is quiet and heavy. For townspeople, bounty hunters introduced another tension. Justice was necessary, certainly. Communities wanted stability. They wanted stolen property returned. They wanted violent offenders removed, but they also valued autonomy. The West had a strong streak of independence. Outsiders arriving with authority, especially privately motivated authority, could unsettle that balance. There were moments when bounty hunters clashed not with fugitives, but with local sentiment. A town might protect one of its own. A family might stand in defiance. The frontier was not uniformly aligned with legal codes. It was aligned with relationships. So a bounty hunter had to weigh social risk as carefully as physical risk. Push too hard, and a community might turn cold. Move too cautiously, and the fugitive might slip away. This delicate negotiation contributed to their feared reputation. They were skilled at walking into unfamiliar places and adjusting their tone within minutes. Friendly when useful, firm when necessary, always measuring. And then there is the economic truth beneath it all. Bounty hunting existed because the state could not yet fully enforce its own laws across distance. It was a temporary solution to a structural problem. Private individuals filling gaps in public authority. That arrangement is inherently uneasy. When justice is tied to reward money, motivations blur. Success is incentivized, efficiency is rewarded. And sometimes the line between persistence and obsession thins. For the outlaw, the knowledge that someone might pursue you purely because the number attached to your name was attractive could feel impersonal in the worst possible way. You were not hunted out of revenge. You were hunted because you were profitable. There is something unsettling about being reduced to arithmetic, and yet, for all this, bounty hunters were not mythical enforcers of inevitable doom. They were men navigating a rough system in a rough landscape. Some were ethical, some were ruthless, most were practical. They ate poorly on the road, they slept lightly, they endured heat, cold, boredom, and uncertainty. They calculated risk against reward in a ledger that rarely favored comfort. Over time, as the West settled into more formal structures, the need for such figures diminished. Professional law enforcement expanded, records centralized, jurisdictions clarified. The era of freelance pursuit faded gradually rather than dramatically, but the memory of it lingered. The image of the patient tracker crossing wide spaces in steady silence stayed with us because it captures a deeper truth about consequence. You can run far. You can run fast. You can even run convincingly. But if someone is willing to move just as steadily and for just as long, the distance between you eventually narrows. And in the quiet, wind-swept vastness of the Wild West, that narrowing distance was often more frightening than any duel at high noon. And so, as the dust settles gently over this particular corner of the frontier, we are left with something far less explosive than legend would suggest. No dramatic sunset silhouette, no endlessly echoing gunshot, just a profession built on contracts, patience, and the uncomfortable durability of consequence. Bounty hunters were feared not because they were invincible. They were not. They could fail. They could be misled. They could be injured, outnumbered, or simply too late. The West swallowed plenty of determined men without ceremony. They were feared because they represented something slower and harder to escape: follow-through. In a land that advertised reinvention, they were the quiet counter-argument. You could cross a river and call yourself someone new. You could shave your beard and adopt a different accent. You could drift into a mining camp where no one knew your history. But somewhere, your old name might still be tacked to a wooden post. And somewhere else, a man might be reading it with mild interest and a pencil. The fear was cumulative. It built over time, not in seconds. A fugitive might wake before dawn, convinced he heard hooves. He might glance up whenever the saloon door opened. He might measure every stranger with unnecessary suspicion. Even if no bounty hunter ever arrived, the possibility altered his life. That is a peculiar form of power. Bounty hunters did not control towns. They did not pass laws. They did not sit in courtrooms delivering verdicts. They operated in the margins of official authority, stepping in where systems were thin. And margins are where uncertainty lives. To the broader public, they were both reassurance and warning. Reassurance that crimes would not simply dissolve into the horizon. Warning that law, however imperfect, could travel. Over time, as institutions matured, the Wild West became less wild in practical terms. Law enforcement professionalized. Communication accelerated. The private pursuit of fugitives receded from center stage. But the legend endured because it captures something psychologically durable. The idea that you can never be entirely sure you are free from your past. The idea that someone patient, methodical, and sufficiently motivated might still be moving toward you, quietly, without flourish, without hurry. In reality, most bounty hunters were not larger-than-life figures. They were men with worn boots and practical calculations. They endured boredom more often than they encountered gunfire. They relied on small clues rather than grand confrontations. And yet, within that ordinariness lay their unsettling quality. They did not need to be dramatic. They only needed to continue. So why were bounty hunters feared in the Wild West? Because in a landscape built on escape, they specialized in return. Because they were steady in a world that valued speed. Because they did not require anger to pursue you, only a reward, and the patience to cross a very large, very quiet land, one deliberate mile at a time. And with that slow realization drifting across the plains, we can let the wind carry it away. The frontier grows quiet again. Somewhere, a horse shifts its weight. Somewhere else, a wanted poster curls slightly at the edges. And somewhere in between, someone decides whether the number written on that paper is worth the ride. Of course, once you strip away the legend and let the dust settle properly, bounty hunting begins to look less like a heroic saga and more like a long-term freelance contract with unusually high levels of risk. There was no pension plan, no guaranteed income, no formal badge of office that ensured respect. Just an agreement, often informal, that if you delivered a specific person to a specific authority, you would receive a specific amount of money. If you failed, you received experience, which, unfortunately, could not be exchanged for food. This financial uncertainty shaped behavior. A bounty hunter had to choose carefully which notices to pursue. A small reward attached to a distant fugitive might not justify weeks of travel. A larger reward, however, might justify extraordinary persistence. This meant that fear was sometimes proportional to the number printed on a poster. If the reward was substantial, it signaled two things. The crime was serious, and multiple hunters might take interest. Competition added a quiet urgency. A fugitive with a high price on his head might find not one tracker, but several, each operating independently. The idea that more than one person might be tracing your movements without coordinating with each other creates a particular kind of anxiety. You cannot anticipate them all. You cannot negotiate with them collectively. You cannot easily predict which one will arrive first. And arrival, as we've learned, is rarely announced. There were also bounty hunters who specialized. Some focused on specific regions, becoming intimately familiar with certain trails, certain towns, certain personalities. Others developed reputations for handling particular types of cases: violent offenders, train robbers, horse thieves. Reputation, in turn, fed fear. If a fugitive heard that a well-known tracker had accepted his case, the psychological pressure intensified. Even if the tracker was days away, or perhaps nowhere near, the mere rumor of his involvement could disrupt routine. And routine, as we have gently observed, is fragile. It is worth noting that bounty hunting was not uniformly admired even among law enforcement. Some sheriffs welcomed the assistance, others resented the intrusion. Jurisdictional pride existed then as it does now. A local officer might prefer to solve his own cases rather than see an outsider collect the reward. This tension occasionally placed bounty hunters in awkward positions. They were legally justified in their pursuit, yet socially unwelcome. They operated in the space between cooperation and rivalry. For fugitives, this ambiguity was unsettling. There was no single structure to negotiate with. The sheriff might be predictable. The court might be scheduled. A bounty hunter, however, worked on his own timetable. He could wait weeks before making contact. He could appear at dawn. He could decide that today was finally convenient. This unpredictability eroded the illusion of safety. And yet, in the quieter corners of the West, there were bounty hunters who lived relatively ordinary lives between contracts. They took temporary jobs. They visited family. They rested horses. The profession did not always demand constant motion. It required readiness. Readiness is a subtle posture. It means your saddle is maintained. Your information is current. Your resolve is intact. So that when a new notice appears, you can move without hesitation. Over decades, as rail travel shortened distances and telegraphs tightened communication, fugitives found it increasingly difficult to rely on geography alone. The frontier's vastness had once been its greatest shield, but infrastructure gradually eroded that shield. In this transition period, bounty hunters stood at the intersection of old and new systems. They were remnants of a looser era, functioning within tightening frameworks. And perhaps that is part of their enduring fascination. They symbolize a moment when law was mobile, when justice rode horseback, when a single determined individual could traverse enormous spaces with nothing more than a description and a number. Why were they feared? Because they were not bound to one town, because they did not require permission to continue, because they had both incentive and time, and in a landscape where many hoped the horizon would swallow their past, bounty hunters were a reminder that horizons are not walls. They are simply distances waiting to be crossed, slowly, deliberately. One patient mile at a time. One patient mile at a time is not an especially glamorous motto. It does not fit well on a poster. It does not inspire stirring speeches. But it does explain how bounty hunters functioned in a land that was constantly in motion. Movement defined the West. Settlers moved westward. Railroads moved goods. Cattle drives moved herds across enormous distances. Gold rushes pulled entire populations from one territory to another almost overnight. In such a restless environment, it was tempting to believe that you could simply blend into the flow. And for a while, you often could. But bounty hunters understood movement differently. They did not see it as chaos. They saw it as patterns unfolding over time. If enough people moved through certain rail junctions, someone would eventually notice a familiar face. If stagecoaches stopped in predictable towns, fugitives might pass through them too. If mining camps grew rapidly, they required labor, anonymous, temporary labor. Patterns once identified could be revisited. So bounty hunters returned to the same places more than once. They re-asked questions. They checked whether a rumor that led nowhere last month had evolved into something useful. They were not embarrassed to circle back. Persistence is repetitive, and repetition can be unnerving. For fugitives, the frontier promised expansion, open space, fresh beginnings. But expansion does not eliminate memory. It only spreads it thinner. A wanted notice posted in one town could be copied and sent elsewhere. A description could be relayed along telegraph lines. The further a fugitive traveled, the more opportunities there were for someone to recognize him. Recognition was the true threat. Most men in the West carried firearms. Many were capable of violence. That fact alone did not make bounty hunters uniquely frightening. What distinguished them was intent. They were looking for you, specifically you, not generically enforcing order, not responding to random trouble. They had a name, a face, and a financial reason to connect the two. There is something deeply personal about being pursued by someone whose entire objective is your capture, and yet the pursuit itself was rarely dramatic. More often, it was slow attrition. A fugitive might change towns repeatedly, each time sacrificing stability. New job, new acquaintances, new risks. Constant relocation wears on a person. It prevents roots from forming. Bounty hunters relied on that fatigue. They did not need to catch you immediately. They needed to make staying hidden exhausting enough that mistakes became inevitable. And mistakes, in a loosely organized frontier, echoed loudly. A misstep at a saloon, a quarrel that escalated, a careless boast. The hunter did not have to orchestrate these moments. He only had to remain attentive when they occurred. This attentiveness fostered an aura of inevitability. Even if the reality was far messier, the perception mattered. If bounty hunters were known for eventually succeeding, fear magnified that reputation. Reputation is a force multiplier. It means that even before a hunter arrives, his shadow precedes him. Communities might whisper, "He's been asking about you." And that whisper alone could disrupt an entire plan. Of course, not all bounty hunters were paragons of discipline. Some were reckless. Some exaggerated their exploits. Some accepted dubious contracts. The profession had no standardized training, no oversight committee ensuring ethical conduct. It was a reflection of its time, improvised, inconsistent, evolving. But within that inconsistency lay its menace, because unpredictability adds to fear. You did not know whether the man pursuing you was cautious or impulsive, fair or opportunistic, patient or desperate. And uncertainty, once again, unsettles the mind. As the 19th century progressed and legal institutions expanded westward, the necessity for freelance pursuit diminished. State and federal agencies strengthened. Communication networks grew denser. The map felt smaller. Yet during that earlier, looser period, bounty hunters occupied a peculiar role. Part entrepreneur, part law enforcer, part traveler. They were feared not because they embodied chaos, but because they carried consequence across distance, in a place where distance was supposed to protect you. And that contradiction lingered in the air of the frontier, dry, persistent, and difficult to ignore. And difficult to ignore is perhaps the most accurate description of what bounty hunters represented. They were not storms that swept through town in a burst of spectacle. They were more like weather patterns, gradual, forming at the edge of awareness, advancing without hurry. In the early decades of westward expansion, enforcement was uneven by necessity. Vast territories were governed by small numbers of officials. Court sessions might be infrequent. Records were handwritten and locally stored. In that environment, escape seemed plausible. You could ride out of one jurisdiction and, at least temporarily, enter a gray zone. But gray zones invite intermediaries. Bounty hunters thrived precisely because law was present, but thin. There was enough structure to authorize pursuit, but not enough infrastructure to carry it out consistently. They bridged that gap with private initiative. Private initiative, however, is rarely neutral. It is guided by incentive. A posted reward transformed a crime into a financial opportunity. That transformation did not negate justice, but it complicated it. The pursuit became transactional. Capture was monetized. Persistence had a price. For fugitives, this meant that time did not erase value. As long as the reward remained active, your name retained market interest. Even months later, someone might decide the sum was worth revisiting. The passage of time, therefore, did not guarantee safety. It only altered the calculations. This subtle tension altered behavior in ways that are easy to overlook. A fugitive might avoid forming close friendships, fearing exposure. He might decline certain jobs that required identification. He might avoid places where telegraph lines were active. Every decision narrowed his options. Freedom became conditional. Bounty hunters, in contrast, operated with comparative flexibility. They could pause a pursuit, accept temporary work, reassess strategy. Their movement was deliberate rather than reactive. They were not running from the past, they were walking toward it. That asymmetry is unsettling. One man improvising survival, another man patiently converging, and yet, in fairness, bounty hunters were not immune to the same frontier hardships as everyone else. They endured the same shortages, the same uncertain weather, the same risks of illness. Their profession did not grant immunity from misfortune. A sudden storm could halt travel. A sick horse could delay a capture. A mistaken lead could cost weeks. The West was vast enough to humble anyone, but humility did not necessarily diminish fear. If anything, the fact that bounty hunters succeeded despite these obstacles enhanced their reputations. To track someone across hundreds of miles without modern technology required endurance. It required discipline. It required a tolerance for monotony that few people possessed. Monotony, it turns out, can be a professional asset. While others sought excitement or quick gains, bounty hunters cultivated steadiness. They followed trails others abandoned. They revisited towns others dismissed. They believed that patience would eventually compress distance, and often it did. The legend of the lone tracker riding into town at sunset persists because it condenses months of uneventful labor into a single image. It simplifies the ledger entries, the repeated questions, the unremarkable nights under open skies. But behind every dramatic arrival lay extended stretches of ordinary persistence. That is what made bounty hunters feared in practical terms. They were not explosive. They were durable. In a culture that prized bold action and swift escapes, durability felt almost unfair. You could outshoot a man in a duel. You could outrun him for a day. But could you outlast him for weeks? For months? Across states? That question lingered quietly over the frontier, even when no hunter was visible. And perhaps that lingering question, more than any gunfight, defined the unease surrounding them, because it suggested that some consequences were not loud. They were simply patient, and patience, given enough miles, tends to close the gap. And when the gap finally closed, it rarely felt cinematic. There was no dramatic speech about destiny, no carefully framed silhouette against a blood-orange sunset. More often, it was a quiet recognition, a moment where two sets of eyes met, and both understood why. The fugitive understood that the waiting was over. The bounty hunter understood that the waiting had worked. There is something deeply unromantic about that exchange. It is not triumph so much as completion, a task concluded, a contract fulfilled, a line in a ledger ready to be marked. But to understand why bounty hunters were feared, we have to linger not just on the capture, but on the waiting that preceded it. Waiting alters behavior. When you suspect you are being pursued, even loosely, you begin to edit yourself. You speak less freely. You move less predictably. You evaluate strangers with more suspicion than courtesy. Life narrows into a series of cautious decisions. The bounty hunter did not need to knock on your door to influence your life. His potential presence was enough. In that sense, bounty hunters extended the reach of law beyond its visible boundaries. The sheriff's authority might stop at the edge of town. A judge's ruling might apply only within certain lines on a map. But the bounty hunter, motivated by reward rather than jurisdiction, could cross those lines without hesitation. That mobility is what made them unsettling. They were not tied to community. They were not accountable to voters. They were accountable to outcome. Outcome is blunt. You are either delivered or you are not. There is no committee review, no annual report, no public debate about strategy, just a pursuit measured by success or failure. Of course, over time, the West matured. Rail lines connected remote settlements. Telegraph networks reduced informational isolation. Formal law enforcement agencies gained resources and coordination. The need for freelance bounty hunters gradually diminished. The profession did not vanish overnight, but it became less central. And yet, the image endured. It endured because it taps into a broader human discomfort, the idea that you cannot indefinitely outrun consequence. In the American frontier mythos, the horizon symbolizes freedom, opportunity, escape from constraint, reinvention. The bounty hunter complicates that symbol. He suggests that horizons are not barriers. They are distances, and distances can be crossed. Slowly, deliberately, without drama. If we remove the cinematic exaggeration and examine the historical reality, we find something quieter, but perhaps more compelling. Bounty hunters were not mythical enforcers. They were practical men navigating an unfinished legal system in a vast, unfinished land. They endured boredom, they endured risk, they endured uncertainty, and they relied on one principle above all others: Persistence outlasts panic. Outlaws relied on bursts of motion, on chaos, on rapid decisions. Bounty hunters relied on repetition, on patience, on the steady accumulation of small advantages. That contrast created fear, not because bounty hunters were everywhere, but because they did not need to be. They only needed to exist as a possibility with boots, a possibility with a saddle, a possibility willing to ride farther than you expected. And so, when we ask why bounty hunters were feared in the Wild West, the answer is not found in gunfights or dramatic showdowns. It is found in endurance, in the uncomfortable knowledge that even in a land of vast distances and fresh starts, someone might still be keeping track. And keeping track, as history gently reminds us, requires neither spectacle nor speed, only time, and the willingness to use it. And sometimes that decision was made in silence. No dramatic oath, no whispered vow of justice, just a quiet moment in which a man studied a notice and thought, very practically, that might be worth the trouble. Trouble, of course, was guaranteed. The West did not offer smooth roads or predictable outcomes. Rivers swelled unexpectedly. Trails disappeared. Towns that once bustled could empty in months when mines failed or cattle markets collapsed. A bounty hunter chasing a fugitive into a fading settlement might arrive to find little more than abandoned buildings and second-hand rumors. Rumors, as we've gently noted, were abundant, but reliable ones were rare. This required a certain emotional steadiness, the ability to accept wasted effort without theatrical frustration. A week lost to false leads could not be undone. It could only be absorbed. The hunter adjusted, recalculated, continued. Meanwhile, the fugitive's life narrowed further. Constant motion meant limited trust. You could not grow too close to anyone. You could not explain your past fully. You could not risk too much visibility. The frontier may have appeared spacious, but socially it could become claustrophobic when secrecy governed every interaction. The bounty hunter exploited that claustrophobia indirectly. He did not need to confront you daily. He needed to ensure that your world remained slightly unstable, that you could never feel entirely settled, that at any point a stranger might be more observant than he appeared. The fear was cumulative, small, persistent. It did not spike dramatically. It lingered, and lingering fear is tiring. Fatigue leads to misjudgment. Misjudgment leads to opportunity. Opportunity, for a bounty hunter, was the point where patience converted into payment. There were cases where fugitives attempted to negotiate, offer a share of stolen money, propose alternative arrangements, appeal to shared hardship. Sometimes such negotiations failed instantly, but the reward system was structured too. But the reward system was structured to discourage such compromises. Payment required delivery, delivery required custody, and custody required control. Control, however, was never absolute. Transporting a prisoner across open terrain left room for sudden reversals, a desperate escape attempt, an unexpected ally, a hidden weapon. Even after a successful capture, danger remained until the handover was complete. This prolonged risk contributed to the profession's reputation. It was not a quick exchange. It was an extended commitment from pursuit through return. Commitment implies endurance. Endurance inspires both respect and fear. As the 19th century gave way to more centralized authority, the image of the bounty hunter shifted from practical necessity to cultural symbol. Dime novels exaggerated exploits. Later, films distilled complexity into archetype. But beneath those embellishments lies a simpler truth. Bounty hunters were feared because they represented continuity. In a society that was rapidly changing, expanding, improvising its own structures, they embodied a through line, a thread connecting action to response. You might gamble on distance, you might gamble on reinvention, but you could not fully gamble on forgetfulness, because someone, somewhere, might still be willing to remember. And remembering, when paired with persistence, becomes pursuit. So the frontier settles into evening again. The wind moves softly through open land. A town closes its doors for the night. And in the dim light of a boarding house or beside a campfire, a man studies a name written carefully in ink. Not with anger, not with spectacle, but with quiet calculation. Is it worth the ride? And if the answer is yes, the miles will begin to shrink. Slowly, inevitably, one patient stretch of land at a time. And as the miles slowly disappeared beneath worn hooves, something else disappeared as well. Illusion. The illusion that distance guaranteed safety. The illusion that time erased memory. The illusion that the horizon functioned as a wall rather than a challenge. Bounty hunters did not shatter these illusions dramatically. They eroded them. Erosion is not loud. It is gradual. A fugitive might spend months believing he had succeeded. He might begin to feel almost comfortable. He might invest in new clothes, develop routines, learn the names of shopkeepers, allow himself to laugh without checking the door every few minutes. Comfort is dangerous. Comfort creates predictability. Predictability creates patterns. And patterns, as we have patiently explored, are traceable. The bounty hunter's advantage was not speed, it was attention to those patterns. A man who always left town before certain visitors arrived. A man who avoided places where official notices were posted. A man who paid in cash but refused to share details of his origins. Small deviations from ordinary behavior become visible when someone is specifically looking for them, and bounty hunters were always specifically looking. It is important to understand that the fear they generated was not constant panic. It was background tension, a low hum beneath daily life. The knowledge that your story might still be circulating in places you had never visited. A wanted notice could be copied. Descriptions could be repeated. Rewards could be reposted. Information did not travel perfectly. It traveled imperfectly, but persistently. And persistence, even when flawed, accumulates. The bounty hunter relied on accumulation of rumors, accumulation of sightings, accumulation of time. He did not need certainty at every step. He needed enough fragments to suggest direction. Fragments, when assembled carefully, become a path, and that path often led to a quiet confrontation. There is something almost anticlimactic about the historical reality. A hand placed firmly on an arm, a brief identification, a weapon drawn not to fire but to discourage resistance, a reminder of the posted reward. Sometimes there was protest, sometimes resignation, sometimes silence. But always, if the hunter succeeded, movement reversed. The fugitive who once rode outward now rode back, back toward court, back toward a town he had hoped never to see again, back toward consequence. This reversal carried symbolic weight. In a culture obsessed with westward motion, bounty hunters represented return. Return is uncomfortable. Return suggests unfinished business. Return implies that departure was temporary. Communities understood this symbolism instinctively. Even those who distrusted bounty hunters recognized that without some mechanism of return, frontier order would collapse entirely. Theft, violence, and fraud would multiply without restraint. The hunter's presence, therefore, functioned as deterrence as much as enforcement. Not perfect deterrence, not universal, but enough to influence decisions. And influence in such a vast environment mattered. As legal institutions matured, the reliance on private pursuit declined. Formal marshals expanded their reach, records centralized, communication accelerated, the frontier's porous edges tightened, yet the cultural memory remained intact because it captured something essential about human systems. Rules only matter if they are followed through. Consequences only matter if they can travel. And in the Wild West, bounty hunters were the vehicles of that travel. Feared not for constant violence, not for theatrical duels, but for steadiness, for their willingness to continue when others stopped, for their refusal to accept that distance equaled disappearance. And so, in the long, quiet stretches between towns, where wind moved across open land and telegraph wires hummed faintly in the distance, the idea persisted: you might run, you might hide, you might even convince yourself you had succeeded. But somewhere, someone might still be riding, not fast, not loudly, just steadily closing the space between past and present. And in that steady closing, fear quietly took root. And once fear takes root quietly, it rarely announces its growth. It spreads beneath the surface. For a fugitive, that spreading tension could become part of daily existence. You wake up, you work, you speak cautiously, you glance at new arrivals, you measure conversations for hidden meaning. Over time, this vigilance becomes exhausting. Exhaustion invites mistakes. Mistakes invite attention. Attention invites confirmation, and confirmation is precisely what a bounty hunter seeks. There is a curious symmetry to the relationship between hunter and hunted in the Wild West. Both men are often alone. Both are moving across unfamiliar terrain. Both are calculating risk constantly. The difference is direction. The fugitive moves outward, trying to widen the gap. The bounty hunter moves inward, trying to narrow it. This quiet convergence gives the profession its unsettling quality. It is not chaos colliding with chaos. It is two trajectories slowly intersecting, and intersection, when inevitable, carries weight. Many bounty hunters understood that confrontation was the least efficient part of their work. The ideal capture required minimal spectacle, surprise, clarity, restraint, a sudden shift from anonymity to identification. "You are the man named on this notice." That sentence, spoken calmly, might end months of flight. In that moment, fear crystallizes, not because of shouting, not because of violence, but because recognition has arrived. Recognition is final. It confirms that the fragments you left behind, your name, your description, your past actions, have traveled farther than you expected. The bounty hunter's power lay in that confirmation, yet we should not exaggerate their omniscience. The West was vast enough to swallow many pursuits. Some fugitives genuinely disappeared. They moved beyond borders. They adopted entirely new lives. Records were imperfect. Communication was delayed. Success was never guaranteed. But the possibility of success was sufficient to alter behavior, and altering behavior is itself a form of influence. Communities, too, adjusted around the presence of bounty hunters. They learned to observe strangers more carefully, to decide whether to cooperate or resist, to weigh loyalty against legality. The hunter's arrival could stir quiet debates within a town. Is he here for justice or profit? Is the fugitive truly dangerous or simply unfortunate? These questions did not have universal answers. The frontier was morally inconsistent. Laws varied, enforcement varied, perception varied. But even within that inconsistency, the bounty hunter's role remained clear. He existed because action had occurred, and action had a posted price. Over time, the mythology grew larger than the reality. Stories favored dramatic standoffs and legendary marksmen. They simplified complexity into archetypes. They replaced ledger books with silhouettes. Yet beneath those embellishments, the core truth remains understated. Bounty hunters were feared because they extended memory across distance. They were reminders that the frontier was not entirely blank space, that ink on paper could travel, that incentives could motivate endurance, that someone might be willing to invest weeks, even months, in the slow narrowing of a gap. This is not the fear of sudden violence. It is the fear of sustained attention. To be the subject of sustained attention, focused, deliberate, patient, is unsettling in any era. In the Wild West, where anonymity seemed possible and reinvention seemed accessible, that attention disrupted the promise of escape. And so the legend persists, even as the practical necessity faded. A man reading a notice, a saddle tightened before dawn, a long road stretching outward, not toward excitement, not toward glory, but toward resolution. Quiet, methodical resolution. And resolution, when it finally arrived, rarely felt triumphant. It felt inevitable. That may be the most quietly unsettling aspect of bounty hunters in the Wild West. Not that they were unstoppable, not that they were flawless, but that when they succeeded, it often seemed less like a dramatic victory and more like a process completing itself. The West, for all its mythology of freedom and fresh starts, was still constructing systems of accountability. They were uneven, improvised, sometimes inconsistent, but they were forming. Bounty hunters operated within that formation. They were not architects of the system. They were proof that it was beginning to function. When a fugitive was returned to face trial, the act symbolized more than a single arrest. It symbolized that distance alone did not dissolve responsibility, that a crime committed in one place could matter in another, that memory written down could travel farther than a man on horseback. This realization slowly reshaped the frontier. Communities began to understand that disappearance was not guaranteed, that mobility had limits, that reinvention required more than simply crossing a county line, and that subtle shift in understanding altered behavior. You may not think about a bounty hunter every day, but you think differently knowing one could exist. The presence of possibility influences choice. A would-be outlaw might hesitate before stealing a horse, knowing that the owner could post a reward. A debtor might reconsider skipping bail if he understood that someone could legally retrieve him. Fear does not need to be constant to be effective. It needs to be plausible. Plausibility was the bounty hunter's greatest asset. He did not need to patrol every mile of open land. He only needed to demonstrate occasionally that he could cross it. Those occasional demonstrations were enough to sustain the profession's reputation. And reputation, once established, does half the work. The stories that survived into legend often highlight the most dramatic pursuits, but the quieter reality is what sustained the system. Men who rode long distances without fanfare, who asked repetitive questions without impatience, who understood that boredom was part of the job. Boredom, oddly enough, is rarely portrayed in heroic narratives. But in history, boredom is often the backdrop to consequence. The Wild West was not constant action. It was long stretches of waiting, punctuated by short bursts of decision. Bounty hunters fit perfectly into that rhythm. They matched the land's tempo, slow, steady, unconcerned with spectacle. So why were they feared? Because they contradicted the illusion of endless escape. Because they represented the uncomfortable truth that someone might care enough about your past to follow it. Because they converted ink into movement, a name on paper into miles on a trail. And in a land defined by miles, that conversion mattered. As the frontier matured into a more structured society, bounty hunters became less central and more symbolic. Professional agencies absorbed much of their function. Communication tightened. Records centralized. The map felt smaller, but the psychological imprint remained. The idea that consequence might arrive without hurry, that someone patient might be on your trail, that the horizon is not protection, but distance, and distance given enough time shrinks, quietly, without spectacle, without applause, just the steady rhythm of hooves across open ground, carrying the past forward until it meets the present. And when it does, there is no dramatic music, only completion. And completion, in the end, is a very quiet thing. No thunderclap, no triumphant anthem, just a ledger closed, a signature added, a payment counted out in careful bills. If we step back from the dust and the mythology, bounty hunters in the Wild West were less symbols of chaos and more indicators of transition. They existed because the frontier was not yet fully governed, but no longer entirely lawless. They filled a gap that was slowly shrinking, and in filling that gap, they carried something unsettling with them. Continuity. The West promised rupture. Leave your past behind. Ride far enough and become someone new. Reinvent yourself under a wider sky. But bounty hunters suggested a quieter counterpoint. Reinvention has limits. You can change your location. You can alter your name. You can grow or shave a beard with admirable determination. But you cannot easily erase a record once it has been written down and given value. That value, $50, $100, sometimes more, transformed memory into motivation. It created a reason for someone to care about your whereabouts long after you had stopped caring about theirs. And caring, when tied to reward, is persistent. This is why they were feared. Not because they were invulnerable. Not because they were universally admired, but because they were willing to continue. They embodied the idea that unfinished business does not evaporate simply because it is inconvenient. That distance is measurable. That time, when used patiently, narrows gaps. In practical terms, many bounty hunters lived ordinary, difficult lives. They endured heat and cold. They miscalculated routes. They followed bad leads. They went unpaid when pursuits failed. They were as vulnerable to the land as anyone else. Yet their profession amplified a simple truth. Consequences can travel. And when consequences travel, even slowly, they reshape behavior. In the quiet towns scattered across the frontier, the possibility of a bounty hunter's arrival influenced decisions long before any rider appeared on the horizon. That influence, subtle, indirect, persistent, was their real power. So when we ask why bounty hunters were feared in the Wild West, the answer is not found in cinematic standoffs. It is found in steadiness, in the image of a man reading a notice by lamplight and deciding without drama that the miles ahead are worth crossing, in the knowledge that someone might be tracing your past not out of passion, but out of obligation and incentive, in the uncomfortable awareness that horizons are not barriers, they are simply distances, and distances, given enough patience, eventually shrink. So the frontier settles into evening once more. The wind moves across open land. A wanted poster flutters slightly against a wooden wall, and somewhere beyond the last line of telegraph poles, a horse begins to walk. Not fast, not loudly, just steadily, toward a name written in ink, toward a number that makes the journey worthwhile, toward the quiet, inevitable meeting of past and present. And with that, we let the dust settle, slowly, as it always does.